I hear from people today whose children are still having these experiences that
Mm-hmm.
if they ask the Sunday school superintendent a question that they can't answer, then the child is a problem. Those disciplines applied to anomalies in the Bible or anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible that opened up a whole other story that was not the familiar Orthodox Christian story, but was a story of Paleo-Contact in the deep past. And the answers I was getting to these questions were most unsatisfactory. And so when I went to theological college, I went wanting to answer those questions for myself. And my desire, I suppose, was to try and close the gap between what churchianity looked like and what I was finding in the stories of Jesus and the apostles.
Greetings, humans. Welcome to Dave's Multiverse. Today we are joined by Paul Anthony Wallis, internationally bestselling author, Paleo-Contact researcher, and former Anglican archdeacon with 33 years inside the church. His Eden series has sold over 120,000 copies worldwide, and his YouTube channel, The Fifth Kind, reaches millions, exploring humanity's cosmic origins, which is what we like to do right here. So, Paul, thank you for joining the Multiverse, man. It's an honor to have you.
G'day, Dave. G'day, Megan. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Thank you. And Megan, my lovely producer, as always, how are you?
Oh, great. Happy to be here. Excited for this chat.
Yeah, it looks like it's nice and sunny and beautiful from your window there.
We're getting there. It's been a rainy spring, but it's good for forest fires, so we'll take it.
Cool. And I'll start there anyway. Megan's in Vancouver Island. I grew up in Nova Scotia. Paul spent some time back and forth between Montreal and home in London, in England. In London, where in England were you at the time?
Yeah, near London. I grew up in Buckinghamshire, about 30 miles northwest of London, in the country where the commuting stops and the farming starts. That was sort of the world I grew up in.
That sounds like gorgeous. My wife and I spent some time in the UK a couple of years ago, and I can't wait to go back. But what your environment growing up? What was it like? What kind of school? Like, it was a small school, a small town. Tell us about it. The farming area.
Yeah, so I grew up in a beautiful village right on the edge of farming country. So it was a village where everyone knew each other. So it was a beautiful, secure place to grow up as a small child. And, the smells of farming are like ratatouille moments for me. They really take me back to a happy place. The smell of pigs, the smell of cattle, those are like home smells for me. And it was an exciting time to be growing up, really. The end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, end of the 60s in particular was a very optimistic time to be growing up. And I remember the feeling of living in a world that felt like we were going in a good direction, that the future meant progress. And so my earliest memories, I know, if only. I mean, that's how we all felt at that time.
Yeah.
And I remember being really proud of my dad's work, which was about opening up the world to international tourism. So he was in civil aviation.
Okay.
And the feeling that the world was progressing and the world was opening up for everyone, that was the world I was born into. And this little village in Buckinghamshire had a sweet little school, Prestwood Primary School.
That's what I wanted to hear about your school. Yeah.
Now, it was a state school, a public school, but back in the day, it would feel like a church school would feel today. So we were praying, we were singing Christian hymns. There was a background of sort of Orthodox Christian belief behind everything. And funnily enough, that was where my early negative view of religion came from, because my earliest memory with regard to like an intellectual journey or a faith journey comes from when I was 5 years old. And I was in school assembly on a Monday morning. and our principal, Mrs. May, came in. All the schools gathered, and she says, Mrs. Clark's class are now going to teach us a new hymn. Mrs. Clark was the one teacher who could play the piano, so her class always taught the new hymns. And this hymn began with the words, "When Jesus was a little boy." And the hymn went on to say, when Jesus was a little boy, he was good as gold. He did everything his parents told him. He was always obedient and nice to his teachers. His behavior was exemplary, and so, children, should yours be. That was the message of the hymn.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting there at 5 years old thinking, this is pathetic. Do they think we're stupid? They are just using the name of Jesus to try and get us to do what they want us to do. And so my earliest thoughts about religion were about how institutions can hijack a story like the story of Jesus and use it for manipulation. And I went home and I complained to my dad about it. I said, Dad, these teachers at 5 years old, I just felt so insulted. I mean, we're smarter than this, for goodness sake. So I said to my dad, who was reading his newspaper at the time, I said, Dad, these teachers talk about God as if they know what they're talking about, like as if they've met him. But they haven't. They've never seen him. For all they know, God could be a giant green dragon. And my dad from behind his paper said, yes, Paul, you're probably right. And I think he said that because he was in the middle of an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph. But those words that he spoke hit home for me. Yes, Paul, you're probably right. Meant that he was affirming my curiosity and my skepticism, and he was not supporting the teachers. And it gave me the encouragement I needed to retain some independence of thought here. And that was really the beginning of my intellectual journey.
Fabulous.
That is fabulous. I have this mildly similar memory of being about 7 or 8 in church, and I don't remember what triggered it. I grew up in a Catholic church, and it wasn't like it's any sort of negative experience. I just remember like looking around at the adults around me and feeling like something was off. And it wasn't about Catholicism in general. It was about like the messaging and like, how the adults around me were acting versus the messages you were being told. Yeah.
And I think for a kid, it's somehow disturbing to see a group of adults so passive.
Yes.
I think that is difficult for a child to see. Now, I never had to experience that. Thank goodness. We were not a church-going family. We were not a Christian-believing family. In fact, I remember being out for a walk one day with my mum, and we walked past this village hall where the church used that hall for Sunday school on a Sunday morning. And my mum said to me, Paul, do you think you'd be interested in going to Sunday school? And because it had the word school in it, I knew straight away that the answer would be no. So I just said, no, I don't need to do that. No. School Monday to Friday is enough for me, thanks. And that was the end of that discussion. So I never went to Sunday school. We never went to church. We were a non-believing family, and I had freedom to pursue my own thoughts and my own ideas. And so I'd established, my own mind before ever I was exposed to the world of church much later.
Paul, you're killing me here because I actually did go to Sunday school like about 5 or 6 times. And eventually the Sunday school teacher like pulled my mom aside and was like, hey, we don't want him back anymore, because apparently I don't have a big recollection of this, but like I was asking too many questions that they couldn't answer. Yeah.
You wouldn't believe this is still happening. I hear from people today whose children are still having these experiences that if they ask the Sunday school superintendent a question that they can't answer, then the child is a problem.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think in a lot of churches, the people who lead Sunday schools or Bible study groups for adults, they feel that their job is to get everyone involved to a point where they can parrot what we believe of that church community. And they feel that they failed if they can't get the child or adult to agree with all that stuff. So they feel this pressure on them, whether it's really imposed or illusory. And so a child who has too many questions or questions you can't answer then becomes a threat to that person's feeling of I'm nailing this, I'm doing the right thing. But I think it's appalling, because what is happening is that the intelligence of children and adults, come to that, is being shut down by that approach. Because if you've seen something that the group hasn't seen, if you're seeing something obvious and are not willing to be gaslighted on it or accept an answer that is totally inadequate, that's probably because you're smarter than the group in that moment. And for the message to come, you need to shut that down, especially with a child, is an absolute scandal. Children have an acute conscience, and they're smart, and they can be geniuses in their thinking. And we should be nurturing that, not shutting it down. I have been really thrilled watching my kids growing up, and they have attended a few Sunday schools, because eventually I went into the world of ministry. As you know, for 33 years, I was in church-based ministry. So they have experienced Sunday schools, but they've also been to schools that are Christian schools, or they're church-based. And so from time to time, my kids would come home and say things along the lines of, we were doing this Bible study at school and the teacher said this, but it didn't make sense to me. I didn't think that was quite right. And I've always been thrilled to hear that. And I always encourage that. So I always ask my kids, so what did you think? And then we have a conversation. And very often I find myself saying, I like how you think. I think along similar lines. And one time, my daughter, Evie, when she was 11 years old, came home. And I think at school, they'd looked at a moment in the Bible where the character who appears to be God, I'm trying to think of safe words for YouTube, slaughters 70,000 infantry who have done nothing wrong. These are King David's infantry who get killed, incinerated, because the God character wants to teach David a lesson. A terrible lesson, by the way, which is not to question orders. And so this was presented as something that God did. And my daughter didn't think that sounded right. She said, a God of love wouldn't do that, would he, Daddy? It doesn't make sense, does it? And I said, well, I would have very similar questions, Evie. Did you say something? And she said, yes, I put my hand up. And I said to the teacher, a God of love would do that. Surely, how does that make sense? Is this really a story about God? And I said, what did your teacher say? And she said, well, he gave an answer, but I'm not sure that he really believed what he was saying. Oh, I was thrilled with that answer, because not only was Evie asking the right questions, had a healthy conscience to know right from wrong, even when she's being gaslighted on the subject, but she was also able to tell the difference between somebody speaking from thought, conviction, confidence, and someone who's now parroting a script. And I thought, yes, I think if you've got that discernment, Evie, I think you're going to be okay. And that's the kind of intelligence we need to be nurturing in our kids. I wish more conversations of that kind were happening in Sunday schools and Bible study groups around the world.
What if history isn't linear? What if civilizations rise and fall again and again? Discover the shocking truth in Deja Vu, Has Everything Already Been? By my friend Alexander Cheshkovich. Grab your copy now on Amazon. The link is in the description below. And subscribe to Dave's Multiverse on YouTube, Spotify, and Rumble today so you don't miss a thing. Yeah, how perceptive of her at 11 years old to make that discernment in that moment, you know. And I gotta say, look, the affirmation you gave me for not unintentionally about, you know, how shitty it is to suppress, a kid's curiosity and his intelligence and tell him he's bad and he's kicked out of Sunday school or whatever. That brought some tears to my eyes a little bit because, it wasn't, I don't really think of it as a traumatic experience, but I at the time I was like 7 or 8 years old. Right. And, I didn't understand. At the time I was like, oh, great. Now I don't have to go to school on Sunday. Right. But there was like, a lot. I did experience a lot of that, not through my family, but mostly in church and in school, like a regular,
Yes.
like provincial school setting where if I had too many questions, then I was like being annoying or whatever. In fact, like in all through the 3rd and the 4th grade, I had the same teacher who got so tired of me that she just let me read books under my desk and during class. And so I read the entire Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and stuff like that, all under my desk instead of doing the 4th grade. But I don't think I really needed to do the 4th grade anyway. So and not to brag, like I kind of stopped getting smarter after like the 9th grade or something like that. But
these the stories I hear, like yours, of being thrown out, are always from super intelligent people. So I think people should wear these stories as a badge of honor.
Yes.
That show, right from the beginning, I was a smart ass kid and I had a mind on me. I had a correspondence for about 10 years with a famous British politician called Tony Benn. And I may have lost half your audience by saying that because he was a democratic socialist, but he was a conviction politician who people now look back on with a good deal more respect than he was shown during his actual career.
Sure.
But he began his journey, and he was a great intellect. He began his journey in a family that sent him to Sunday school. And the Sunday school teacher phoned his parents up and said, I'm afraid Anthony won't be welcome back from next week on, because when I start speaking to the class, that's when he starts speaking. And it was the obvious objections of surely that can't be right. A God of love wouldn't do this, that, or the other. And for him, that was the beginning of an intellectual journey that took him into the world of politics. But people go into all kinds of worlds, but as pioneers, as independent thinkers, and very often the first sign of that is getting thrown out of Sunday school.
That's so validating for me, Paul. Thank you so much. That was like 38 years of healing or something right there. Thank you very much. Yeah, man. So for me, it was like, I grew up in sort of an abstract poverty setting, during that time and basically my entire childhood. And so I didn't really get much chance to explore my intellect, right? It was a survival situation most of the time. I had to walk to school and work 5 hours a week during high school. I barely passed.
Wow.
But I had this, I knew I could do it. And there was these kids around me that their parents gave them cars when they turned 16 and stuff like that. And they knew they were going to college and stuff, and their parents were going to pay for it or whatever. I had to take a bus from I knew I could do it, but I had to take a bus from Nova Scotia to Iowa. And then join the army in the middle of a war and go to war a couple times to come back and then use my benefits to go to school. So I didn't finish my master's degree till I was 33. I started going to school when I was 25. Yeah. Well, I knew I could do it, man. And, it's not because of a bunch of different reasons. I know I grew up around a handful of smart people who were not able to overcome all that, so I feel super grateful, more than anything, that I was able to do that. I had sort of the resilience to make it through all that.
But you mentioned also that your intelligence was recognized by teachers at school who
Oh
allowed
yeah.
you to do that reading, which would have been super important, I think.
It was, and also I had teachers, especially in classes like English, history, government, stuff like that, who like sort of understood my socioeconomic situation. So and also knew how curious and intelligent I was. So they would sort of give me, cut me a break, when it
Yeah.
came to certain things and like late assignments and whatnot. So I really am grateful to all of those teachers,
Yeah.
because if it wasn't for them, like I probably may not have even made it, graduated high school. Like I don't come from a place where people graduate high school. I think maybe 2 of my group of 10 friends actually graduated high school. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, just to compare notes, I think my really lucky breaks early on were, first of all, choosing the right parents,
Yes, your soul
because
did that.
they actually did encourage my intelligence and my curiosity. And so it was my parents who introduced me to Eric von Daniken. It was their
Oh,
copy.
awesome.
It was their copy of Chariots of the Gods,
R.I.P.
carefully left, that's right, of blessed memory, left lying around the house so I could read it. And then we talked
Amazing.
about it after I'd read it at the age of 11. And then my mum bought me a book, The World Atlas of Mysteries by Francis
Oh
Hitching,
yeah.
which
You're
encouraged
our
me to.
second guest in a row who read that book, by the way. And
Yeah,
that inspired them. Yeah.
it's a great book because it literally does go around the world and talk about mysteries. It doesn't present, a strong alternative narrative. It just says there are these things in history that we can't fully understand or explain. Here are some ideas for you to explore. So it's a superb book for encouraging curiosity. And then my mum bought me a book called Supernature, which was another book that was looking at phenomena that we can't fully explain or understand. So both my parents, but my mum in particular, they were very proactive in nurturing this curiosity and turning me into someone who was a truth seeker and a bit of a detective of life, and not someone who would be fobbed off with answers that didn't really meet the question. So that was fantastic, having mum and dad encouraging that in me. Looking back, I realized it was so important. And then my other big break was at the age of 12, passing a test called the 12 plus, which got me into a better kind of school. Now, I didn't grow up poor. We were a comfortable middle-class family, but we weren't rich enough for me to get a private education. But this 12 plus was an opportunity for a kid who was a little bit smarter to get a better education in high school. And it meant when I went to high school, I had wonderful teachers in all our subjects, but it gave me the opportunity to learn languages as well. And so I learned Latin and French and German, and went on to learn Portuguese and Italian, and then in college, New Testament Greek. And I now see that that was the foundation for my whole journey into and through the world of theology. And it's the bedrock of the work I do now in my Eden books, Escaping from Eden, and the books that have followed it.
Wow. No, this doesn't usually happen, but I'm just seeing a lot of parallels to our journey, because you said at 10, 11 years old, the Von Daniken book came around. Yeah.
Yes, for me, I read it when I was 11.
Okay. For me, when I was 11, I was first introduced to like Robert Schoch, Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, and these guys,
Yes.
because I would sneak out in the middle of the night and turn on the TV to the channel A&E, and I'd watch these old documentaries and stuff. And I'd also watch the show In Search Of, which I'm sure you've heard of. And anyone you've seen In Search Of, Paul?
No, I haven't.
Maybe it was just in Canada and the US. Anyway, it was starring Leonard Nimoy, and he would take you through all these stories, stories like UFOs and cryptids and things like that. But what I remember being like 11 and, thinking like, wow, the pyramids could be way older than they're saying. And I never really got the chance to start exploring this stuff deeply until I got out of the military and, the internet became more widely available. But this isn't about me, it's about you.
Well, let me say a word about Robert Schoch, who you just mentioned, because Robert Schoch is really the reason there is a wider and a more open conversation about the dating of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Before Robert Schoch, there really was only one answer to that question. And the anomalies had not been discovered, pointed out, analyzed. Robert Schoch was the one who came along and looked at the erosion patterns and said, wait a minute, this doesn't line up with the mainstream view. We need to look at this again. And I had the opportunity to work with Robert Schoch last year, which was a great pleasure for me. And we were both in Turkey together in the Van and Bitlis provinces, looking at archaeological sites together. We were both there supporting Matt LaCroix in his movie that he's putting together, The Missing Key. And so the three of us were there at one of these sites where they're making great progress in digging down into the Iron Age story, and maybe even further back than that. And we had a wonderful day of exploring and filming. And at the end of the day, when we were about to leave, all the archaeologists, so this is Turkish archaeologists working on the site there, asked if they could have a group photo with Robert. Not with Matt, not with me. Robert was the one they all knew. They all knew
the archaeologist.
The archaeologist held him in such high regard. They just had to get a group selfie with him. And it was a wonderful moment.
Was Catherine, Katie, his wife, there too?
Yes. Yes.
She's lovely too. They're kind of adorable together, right?
Oh, it was great fun traveling with them. Absolutely. And I enjoyed working with Robert, and because he is a proper academic. I mean, he is a proper scientist. He's a true skeptic. So he's not somebody who walks up and then jumps to some exciting speculative idea. It's very, very systematic, step by step. And I just loved watching him at work, and we really clicked working together in Turkey. And so I'm hoping to do a little bit more with him in the future.
What an honor. Mike and I got to interview him for this show, what we couldn't tell during the time, but the audio was totally screwed and we were not able to use it. It was like the biggest shame. It was the biggest bummer ever. Yeah. And I had to go between my tail between my legs to Robert Schoch, literally one of my heroes, and be like, I'm sorry, Robert. But either way, he was cool about it. And him and his wife are great. And it's funny you say that about how scientific he is, because in his thinking, because so there's the documentary, the Quest for the Lost Civilization. There's this scene where they had just finished diving on Yonaguni with John Anthony West and Graham Hancock, and they come up and Graham and John Anthony West are like, it's a pyramid or whatever. They're not saying those exact words. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
But you can see where they may have cut out what Robert was actually trying to say, because he was in the part in that moment, he said something along the lines of well, I think this merits further further research, study, but and the rest of them were like, and that's no shade against those two. It's just the difference, like you said, between some people are super open and excited that this could be something different and this could change everything, and Robert is not like that at all. The times I've talked to him, he is by the book, so
he is. He's wonderful.
But I wanted to get into Paul, so we've been talking about how you were a question answer and a truth seeker. And so I wanted to get into a little bit into your academic journey, because I know you went to school in Bath. I've been there, lovely city, town. It's actually one of the most beautiful towns in the world.
Yes, it is.
but you've been to a bunch of different schools. You've got couple different degrees. But what was your first entry after high school? You had this great experience in high school. What was your first entry into, post-secondary education?
Yeah, so I did go to the University of Bath, but only for 4 terms.
Okay.
And I started off learning linguistics and modern languages, but it was part of a degree called European Studies. And so those studies, which really interested me, were rolled together with economic history and institutional politics of Europe, which were like a go-to-sleep pill for me. And it was just... I hated it. So I realized I could not do that degree, and there was no other BA degree for me to switch to. If I could have done pure languages at that point, then I would have done. I could have jumped to another university and just done linguistics and languages, but as you say, who would want to move out of Bath?
Right.
So I stayed in Bath for a little bit longer. But I had chosen that degree because I had wanted to go into international banking, because my dad had told me I could make a lot of money that way. And so my idea was to become an interpreter in the world of international banking and then sort of learn the industry from the inside that way. And it was a well-worn career path to go in as an interpreter and then do a sidestep into management. But I was a new Christian when I went to university, and this sense of a calling to ministry was growing inside me. And another reason I didn't continue with that first degree was because my aspirations and energies were shifting in a theological direction. So after Bath, I started my church career working. So from the age of 20, I was working as a pastoral assistant for a church in London, cutting my teeth in ministry. And then from there, I was selected for ordination, and I went to the University of Nottingham to do an honors degree in theology, Bachelor of Theology, at Nottingham, where there was a superb theological faculty, and it was in association with a Church of England college called St. John's College. And I was there for 3 years, and the difference in the experience of study was night and day between Bath and Nottingham. Much as I loved living in Bath, when I got to do theology at Nottingham, now I was hitting my stride. This was absolutely my passion. I really had an affinity for it. And it was a great treat for me to have 3 years to do nothing but study and think through all the issues of faith, and have at my disposal, this is in the days before the internet, have at my disposal these superb libraries of books to educate me in the history of religion and spirituality, mysticism, and then the theology that I was actually there to do for my degree.
Paul, I'm sorry, but you look like you're like 35 and you're talking about growing up in the 60s and stuff like that. And I'm like, it blows my mind. I'm 44. Megan's, well, I'm not going to say, but
37.
we grew up, in that area where you like the transition between like the non-virtual world to the virtual world. So it's nice to be part of that club where like you remember the analog times, especially in the studies,
Oh, it's amazing. Being as old as I am, and this is with no filters, ladies and gentlemen, being as old as I am, I really feel that I've lived in more than one century. Now, of course, a lot of people have. I mean, the 20th century was not that long ago, but I almost feel like I grew up in Dickensian London, and I've lived through all those years into the present day. In fact, apropos of nothing, but Charles Dickens did mention the church that I worked in London for 3 years. Unfortunately, he listed it as the type of church he despised. But nevertheless, we got a noble mention in his writings. But the change, in the world, as I say, my early memories are from the 1960s to now is amazing. And what's great about that is that you have a bit of perspective on everything. You know, you can remember when politics were not like this, or when
Yeah.
mainstream culture was not like this, did not
Yeah.
think in these ways or behave in these
Yeah.
ways. So you become a little bit more detached from things, and I think a little bit freer to compare notes and consider your own view on things, or your own choices about life, or your own lifestyle. So as you will find, Dave and Megan, there are benefits to getting older and older.
Well, I definitely noticed I make a lot less stupid decisions the older I get, which is nice, but also my back hurts a little bit more. I wanted to ask Paul, so what was changing inside you spiritually when you just were feeling this calling to go in that direction? Like, was it a moment, or was it like an inspiration, or like what was going on inside you? Why did you move in that direction?
I think it was really just something I was wired for. I think from my dad and my dad's side of the family, I had some sort of leadership wiring. So now I was in the world of faith. That really did mean leadership in the world of church. And my first pastor, Bishop David Pitches, sort of recognized this in me and encouraged me in this kind of a direction. But I became a Christian when I was 17, and I had a feeling of responsibility, but in an exciting, world-changing kind of way, to be involved in helping the churches to do better at all the Jesus stuff, because I went into Christianity as a skeptic, and full of questions, and I was puzzled by the clear blue water I was seeing between the Gospels and the New Testament, and what churchianity was actually about. And so I would ask, why do we invest so much energy from week to week putting on services in a building for people to come to, when I don't find that at all in the teaching of Jesus? Why are we doing that? And then I had doctrinal questions. Why do we teach this doctrine, so eternal conscious torment, for instance, the doctrine of hell, when I actually don't find that in the Gospels and New Testament? Why do we treat the New Testament as if it's like some kind of divine oracle that can make no mistake, as if it's not a human document? And the answers I was getting to these questions were most unsatisfactory. And so when I went to theological college, I went wanting to answer those questions for myself. And my desire, I suppose, was to try and close the gap between what churchianity looked like and what I was finding in the stories of Jesus and the apostles. So that was probably sums up what I thought I was about at that time.
It's interesting how that started with you asking a question, getting an unsatisfactory answer, going home, asking your dad, and your dad saying, yeah, you're probably right. And that somehow led you down this path. And I think I know what you're getting at, but would you define churchianity for us?
Oh, by that, I just mean the institutional ways in which Christianity has traditionally expressed itself. So meaning, building churches, getting people to go to them, to do services of worship. That is, 95% of what, visible, observable Christianity sort of looks like. That is the Christian tradition as we find it in history. And that's what I had a lot of question marks about.
So why did you find, what was the reason? Why do we do that?
That's a very good question. Well, we've inherited a lot of religious activity from practices that were there before Christianity arrived. And I did not know that. It took me a long time to find that out. So church services, well, that certainly predates Christianity. When I was ordained, I went into parishes that liked to approximate themselves to Roman Catholic liturgy and liturgical practice. And what that meant was that there was a heap of sun worship going on in our ceremonies without me realizing that's what we were doing. So I never stopped to ask, why is there a symbol of the sun behind the head of Mary and Jesus and all the saints? What's that about? Why is there an ancient sun cross on the communion wafer instead of the crucifix of Jesus? Why is there a sun cross on top of the ciborium in which we put the people's wafers? Why is there this huge golden symbol of the sun with a sun cross placed inside it for people to bow down to in the ceremony of benediction? Why, when it comes round to a moment of solstice, I'm using the wrong word, aren't I? It's not... Yes, of course, it is the solstice, where you go and you bow down to the rising sun. And that's how we're telling the story of the resurrection of Jesus, is it? I mean, there are all these elements of sun worship built into Christian practice because they were already part of the cultural practice of religion in the Roman Empire. And they all got brought in when Christianity became the imperial department of religion. So there are things like that that happen. I mean, there's a ceremony that we did where you have a bucket with holy water in it, and then you use pine sprigs or pine cones to sprinkle water over people. I didn't know that the ancient Assyrians did that in the Bronze Age, long before Christianity had come along. So there's been this importation of a heap of things. The processions and the colors and the order of people in the processions, that is all Roman imperial protocol. It's got nothing to do with the Gospels and New Testament. So largely through this association with Roman cultic practice, a heap of things came into Christianity that way, but some things like the sprinkling are even earlier. And I talk about this in my book, The Eden Enigma, the way that we can continue things which become blind motifs, so that we still use the image or we still do the action without knowing what it really is. And then we come up with some justification for why we're doing it. And so whenever I ask questions of my training priest, so why do we do this? I would always be given a Christian answer to the question, and not realize that the original answer was, well, the reason the bishop wears purple is that King Cyrus of the Achaemenid Persian Empire picked that color to be the royal color. And from that time to this, kings, emperors, bishops wear that color as a symbol of power. I wasn't given that answer. I wasn't told about ancient Assyrians. I wasn't told about sun worship. And very probably because my training priest didn't know. He was just simply training me in the way he had been trained.
I was going to ask, I bet a lot of these bishops running around wearing purple don't know why, right?
They don't know why. They don't know why their hat is that shape. They don't know why it's a sun cross on their stole. They don't know why there are pine cones decorating their garments, so on and so forth. They really have become blind motifs.
So, and most people are in church and not noticing any of these things, but which I think most is like, I would say most is really generous. You know, I think like 99% of people who are in church have no idea why and where or why any, including myself, right? Like, you know, and that's why I think your work is so interesting, because it's these reinterpretations of, you know, old ideas and the research that goes into. And so I wanted to before we move on to there, you stayed in this line of work for 33 years, asking all these questions. Were you not a thorn in everyone's side? Did people did you start annoying people, or what? How was that like?
You in Sunday school?
Yeah, exactly.
I think what I was careful to do in my preaching and teaching was to be very clear on things that I thought were very clear. But then if there really was a puzzle or something that didn't make sense, not to avoid it. And so in my teaching and preaching to say, now this is a story that's a bit of a struggle, isn't it? It's difficult to see how this really represents how God is. And so I would just, show people these things without necessarily following the white rabbit of those questions, because I knew it would be wrong to give the impression that everything is stitched up and neat and tidy when it isn't. And I did want to spark the curiosity of my hearers as well. My goal was never to get the hearers to agree with all the conclusions I'd reached at that point in my life. It was to equip them on their own journeys and spark curiosity in them, give them the freedom to ask questions and have their own thoughts. And I think a lot of people enjoyed that about my preaching, but there were some through the years who perhaps thought that was unsatisfactory and unsettling. Perhaps I wasn't doing well enough at simply rehearsing all the familiar stories.
Yeah, you do have a very sort of kind and thoughtful vibe, for lack of a better word. So maybe that has something to do with it too. I mean, if you're being a dick about it, that's not going to come across very well, right?
I'm sure I was a dick about it plenty of times through my years in ministry, but all I can say is I was doing my best.
Got it. And I want to talk about living you built churches in Australia. Can you tell us about
yes,
that?
my ministry included church planting, and which I loved. This is where you start a church community from scratch.
Cool.
And when I was 17, shortly after I'd become a Christian, which was essentially me working out that if I wanted to explore Christianity, I had to do it from the inside. And the only way I could make a move towards Jesus was to recognize that there is clear blue water between the figure of Jesus and the teachings associated with him. There's clear blue water between that and any institutional claim or anything that Christians might say or do in his name. But once I'd worked that out, I thought, yes, this is a journey I want to take. And it was less than a year after that, I think I was regularly praying the prayer, God, send me to churches that need help. Send me to churches with problems, because I don't want to go into a church community that's perfectly happy with itself, because I can only be a fly in the ointment for that kind of community, because I'll always want to do something to move it forward. Send me to communities that know they're in trouble. And so what I was wanting was to become a church doctor.
What does that mean, a church doctor?
So a church doctor really is someone who goes in for a shorter, more surgical kind of intervention. You're there for a shorter time to do a specific thing and fix a specific problem. And so at one end of the spectrum, you might have a situation where there is no congregation where one is needed. And so you start one from scratch. And at the other end of the spectrum, it was community healing assignments. So going into, I can think of one where I went into a church that had repeating problems of a very disturbing kind for about 20 years. And these problems repeated on a cycle, different people involved, different players, and yet these things kept happening. And it involved people, pastors arriving perfectly healthy and then having to be invalided out due to some kind of mental illness. And then families arriving healthy, and then the children becoming sick. And when I went there as an intentional interim, because the diocese worked out, we can't let this happen again. This has to be fixed before another pastor goes in. And I discovered about 88% of the families who still had kids at home were battling some kind of life-threatening illness. So way, way above the normal level. There were governance problems, pastoral problems. And so my job was to help the community name these problems, some of which were totally taboo, were not acknowledged, and then find a way to work through them so that it could find a healthy place before the next pastor came. And that at that end of the spectrum, you're doing work that's not just pastoral, that's not just to do with governance and polity, but it's entity removal. and I had to work with specialist exorcists in, people know what an exorcist is, to address that layer of the story. So there's quite a spectrum of work as a church doctor. I finished my church career as an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia, and that's a troubleshooting role as well. It involves community healing, conflict resolution, appointment processes, oversighting of clergy. And it was work that, with all my work, was stretching. And it was work that kept me in a real sort of experiential place of faith, where it wasn't just about ideas and thoughts, but a sense of real dependence on, I need God's wisdom, I need God's resources if I'm going to be able to get these assignments done and done properly. And the other role I took on in my 33 years in church-based ministry was as a theological educator, which I absolutely loved. So this is training pastors. My topics, the subjects I taught were the history of Christian thought, which is deeply interesting because Christianity hasn't always thought what it thinks now. And in the beginning, Christianity was a kaleidoscope of ideas and theologies and documents and experiences. And I think it's very helpful for people to know that. And then the other subject was hermeneutics, which is the principles of interpreting texts. How do you know you are handling these texts right, getting out of them what the writers intended? And then once you've got that from the text, what do you do with it? Where do you go with that? And those subjects fascinated me. And they were the ones that really led me into the world of Paleo-Contact. It was those disciplines applied to anomalies in the Bible, or anomalies in the stories we tell from the Bible, that opened up a whole other story that was not the familiar Orthodox Christian story, but was a story of Paleo-Contact in the deep past. And it was doing that work that really made me turn a corner and chart a different course.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into the different course, but I want. Would you be okay with sharing about the exorcist experience with that church? I'd be really interested in hearing about that. If you don't want to tell me, that's okay.
Well, I won't go into it in detail, but
Okay.
what I will say is that in the Church of England, every diocese is supposed to have a diocesan advisor in paranormal ministry. And
Wild.
that person and their team exists to support clergy who are having to deal with entity attachment problems. And it may be people with entity attachment problems. It may be places
Like
with
a building?
entity attachment problems, like a building. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a building, but a place. And that was brought in the 1970s in the Church of England, thanks to the work of a wonderful theologian called Gilbert Shaw. And his grounding was in ancient Christian practices. And he was interested in the theology of the church in the first 1,000 years before it split up into Eastern and Western, and long before the split into Catholic and Protestant. And when he went to those theologians, it altered his worldview and told him that we can't be in the world of ministry if we're not prepared to engage with this other layer of reality that's a little bit taboo. And if you go back to the early Christians, they had a belief in entities that they called archons. And archons are essentially energy-based entities that parasite off biological life and that can influence human behavior in negative ways. I mean, some physical parasites do this, but the ancient Greek idea was that these entities can push your emotions so that you're more restless, more fractious, you're angry, you're depressed, you're violent, and then they feed off all that energy. And so the Gnostic Christians would talk about archons manipulating geopolitics so that we have more wars, so that they can feed off all the misery generated by a war. And I think that what they were talking about is similar to what people in ministry encounter when you've got a place or a district that seems to have people locked into negative patterns of behavior. And there is no training at theological college in how to respond to that. And so when I found myself in assignments where I couldn't ignore that layer, I had to learn from people who had become specialists. And in the assignment I mentioned before, it was the bishop who said, now you can't do this on your own. You're going to have to bring in a specialist exorcist. And then when we did the activities that needed doing, it was in partnership with the parish priest of the adjacent parish and another local specialist, because I, on my own, had no expertise in that.
Right.
I had enough wisdom, enough experience to get a sense of what needed doing, but I needed to gather a team in order to do the things that needed to be done. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail because it's fairly recent work, and the people involved are all still around, and so it's not something I would talk about too freely.
Yeah, no, I understand. That's why I was trying to ask the question with some care, because I kind of assumed that. But I just, it's an interesting concept to me, because I've seen in my life, I haven't visually seen, but like I've seen what I believe to be like entity attachments before. And sometimes I wonder, like I know it's a phenomenon for sure. But then I wonder, like, is all like negative behavior some sort of entity attachment, or how much ownership do we have? You know what I mean?
I think we have a lot of ownership. I think you can lose your bearings, your personal sovereignty through trauma, perhaps, or through mental illness. But I think for the most part, I mean, the archontic stories from the Gnostics, I think the main take home from those messages is to do with personal sovereignty. The main take home is look after your emotional state, look after your state of mind, because if you allow yourself to go into a funk of depression or into a state of perpetual rage, you are vulnerable to being manipulated. I mean, if you think about how algorithms work, it's really very, very similar. If you're scrolling through FB and you're responding to every post that's making you angry, well, the algorithm recognizes that. Oh, good, he's engaging with that. Let's give him more stuff to make him angry, because then he'll engage with that. And you go into a spiral. And algorithms behave, I think, in a way very similar to the way archontic entities behave. And a lot of us have had to learn through engaging with social media to be a little bit more self-disciplined than that. If your buttons are being pressed and you're being made furious or depressed, draw a line, turn your computer off, step away, go for a walk, get into nature, recalibrate. Don't let it reach the point where you are spiraling into that state, because you're being manipulated.
There's a lot of people that unfortunately, that I care about, that I've tried to explain that to. And it's like people don't, I'm working in mental health. I know that like people don't change just because you told them to, or you gave them advice. They've got to think that the changes they're deciding on their own. It's like it's idea of sovereignty. But the thing is about the algorithm, you don't even have to make a comment or even click the specific post. If you even slow down on it for a second.
Yes, that's right. It's how long you look at it. That's right.
Yep. And so
that's why my feed is full of cats.
Well, yeah, if you go to my Instagram, it's nothing but adorable animals, like particularly baby animals. But I can't seem to Instagram, I can get to do that, but I can't get Facebook to stop showing me like how everyone hates Trump. And I'm like, I don't care. Like I'm like, I try to say, because you can go like, show me less of this, show me less of this, show me less of this, but I can't get it to stop. And the only reason I wanted to have Facebook is for the podcast. So the ownership I have of it is occasionally I'll take a quick scroll and go, I don't care about politics, like not this type of politics anyway.
And the algorithm polarizes us, of course,
Yes.
because it will be feeding I hate Trump stuff to some people, and then it'll be feeding other information to other people, so that we end up, in essence, having different information in front of us and living in different worlds. And then we wonder why we can't have a conversation about politics or religion or current affairs or whatever it is. So we do have to get a lot smarter about our relationship with algorithms. And I think that's like the tools we develop in guarding ourselves against algorithms are the same tools that guard us against demonic and archontic predation.
Are tools like for example, tools that I teach people, like I used to be a mental health counselor. I don't do that now. I do other forms of social work, but like tools like just mindful behavior, healthy eating, going outside, spending time in nature, spending time with animals, helping people.
Exactly.
Like, how about, is that what we're talking about?
All those things. So at the moment, I have an online learning community called ancientKnowledgeAcademy.com. And I have a course at the Academy about I've called it mindful consciousness. And it's about all those things that you just said, Dave. Those are the real bread and butter things to help you unplug and recalibrate, disengage, find yourself, find your center, and get yourself in an emotionally, mentally healthy place. And it's all the bread and butter things of looking at the rhythm of your life, the rhythm of your sleep, what you're eating, how clean your diet is, how much sunlight you're getting on your skin, how much deep breathing you're doing. I'm an enthusiast for grounding, so walking barefoot so that you're part of the natural electromagnetic exchange between the sun and the planet, so that you're regularizing your body's own electromagnetic field. All these things are the bread and butter stuff of getting yourself in a healthy place. And this is what I was doing immediately before going into the research path that led to Escaping from Eden, The Fifth Kind, and everything that's followed from that. I spent months in the Australian bush, sunning, deep breathing, barefoot walking. And you mentioned animals. It was so interesting because I just finished a very demanding church doctrine assignment, and I needed a pause before doing the next thing. And so I was very deliberate about getting out into the Australian bush, going on these long walks, deep breathing, sunning, grounding. And I remember going on a walk one time, and I was walking along, and I realized something was walking towards me, and it was a little echidna. Now, an echidna is the monotreme, Australian monotreme version of a porcupine. And it walked up to my feet and stopped and looked up at me. And it was just happy to be there looking at me. I thought, oh, wow, what a treat. This is awesome. Aren't you a cute little animal? And it stayed there for as long as I wanted it to. And in the end, it was me who broke off the conversation. I said, well, look, I'm actually out on a walk, but it was lovely to meet you. And so I continued on my walk. And then the next thing that happened was, what was the next animal I saw? I think it was two swamp wallabies hopped up to the path as I walked by. Now, these are very shy animals, and usually they will hop away from a human being, but they hopped up to me and looked at me as I walked by. And I thought, oh gosh, my kids, they're going to be so jealous when I tell them of this walk I've been on. And then I had to pause for a call of nature. While I was attending to that, a little mountain pygmy possum hopped up to my feet. And I thought, oh, wow, aren't you gorgeous? You're a protected species, aren't you? So I'm really lucky to be seeing you.
You're
and
verbalizing
again,
this out loud?
I'm speaking out loud to them.
That's amazing.
This is the kind of person I am. And it just stayed there as long as I wanted it to. And then again, I said, well, I'm off for my walk. And when I walked away, it then hopped back into the roots of the tree. And I thought, this is amazing. I've seen such amazing animals today. I wonder what I'll see next. And as soon as I asked myself that question, the image of a 5-foot-long goanna flashed into my mind. And the funny thing was that my thinking mind then said, oh, don't be silly, Paul. We don't have those in Victoria. It's too cold down here for those. They're up north. They're at the top end of Australia. You're not going to see them here. Well, sure enough, 5 minutes later, what was in the path right in front of me but a 5-foot-long goanna? And it was a wonderful day. And my Aboriginal friends tell me it was a very significant day. Oh, yeah. But how I experienced it was, if I'm now peaceful enough within myself that animals are not frightened of me, then I think I'm in a good place. And I now realize that it was immediately after that I found myself thinking very fresh thoughts and doing fresh research into the biblical texts and seeing things I'd never seen before. And it was that research path that led to all my books and broadcasting in the years since.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And I was going to ask you, like it must have had something to do with your energy from all the breathing and all the nature and all the sun and all the mindful walking and mindful activities and stuff that had you grounded enough and barefoot and all that stuff and centered enough for these animals to be like, oh yeah, he's cool. Right. He's all right. And I think that's really amazing. That's something I think everyone should strive for, is to make it so that animals aren't scared of them.
Yeah.
It's why veterans do, and not just veterans, but a lot of people who experience trauma do equine assisted therapy. When it's done right, the idea is to learn to manage your energy and your emotions through the tools that we discussed, so that you can form a relationship with a horse who's actually a hypervigilant animal by nature. That's why it works.
It's funny. I was thinking about equine therapy just before you said that. I used to live in Canberra, Australia, and there were a number of places around Canberra, particularly in the 80s and 90s, that were using the space available there for equine therapy. And I remember one time I was, this was still in my years in church-based ministry, I was mentoring a young guy who was really having a very difficult time of life. His mum had thrown him out of home when he was 14. And he ended up in social housing with some really difficult people around him who were stealing from him, and then who fed his cats to their dogs. And when that happened, he was in a terrible state. He was really feeling broken, and he asked if I could come and retrieve his half-eaten cat from this dog's pen and then help him bury it. And he was only a young guy, so you can imagine what he was going through. So I did. I went round. We got the poor cat, buried the cat in my back garden, and then I took him. I said, "Let's go for a drive." And we went for a drive down to where I knew there were horses, and we just went and watched the horses. And because I just felt he needed this kind of moment after the trauma that he'd just been through. And to my amazement, one of the horses in the field noticed my friend and came straight to him and wrapped its head round him. And so that horse had identified someone who was actually not in a good place at all, but who needed healing. And the horse obviously had some sense of empathy and compassion towards my friend. And it was a beautiful, beautiful healing moment for him on that awful day. And my respect for horses just soared after I saw that happen in front of me.
Well, the horse gave him a hug, and hugs release oxytocin, which like helps you process trauma, literally. So, how incredible! Moving in towards like what we work on now, I would guess that your early work in linguistics and language really helped you in your early research here, right? When it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. And this was from the get-go, really, from when I went to theological college back when I was 22. One of the questions that I wanted to explore, I mean, never mind the syllabus, something I wanted to explore was what is the what's the word for it? What are the merits of this theology of eternal conscious torment, and where has that doctrine come from, and what do the Gospels and New Testament really talk about? And I approached that as a translation question. And so, with a background in languages, I had some footing to go into the Greek of the texts and work out how the words are being used, why they've been translated in various ways, where translation stops and interpretation starts, and what the root meaning of those words is. And all my Books of the Eden series, when we go to texts, whether it's biblical texts or other ancient texts, I always go to the root meanings of the key words. Because if you've got a word that has been translated into English for 1,000 years as judgment, for instance, there's actually a whole load of doctrines and ideas that will click on when you read that English word. And it will be impossible for you to know the timbre of the original Greek word before all those doctrines were developed. And you won't even know that's what's happened. Whereas if you go to the original language, go to the root meanings, and sometimes if you leave a key word untranslated in the text and then watch how it behaves, that's the best way of peeling back all these layers of preaching and interpretation and interpolation, getting down to what the word actually means. And so texts that on a casual reading look like they're reaffirming all the familiar church stories, you go through that process and you'll realize, no, in the beginning, that text did not say that, did not mean that. And it was through that approach that I was able to see that the hell doctrine was ill-founded, was a church doctrine, not a Jesus doctrine. And in my work today with the Eden series, it's the root meanings of the key words that I recommend that people look at. And it's that opens up these other unfamiliar stories, unfamiliar to us anyway, of ancient ET contact in the pages of the Bible. And you'll see how it is that we've missed this for centuries, how we've misunderstood Paleo-Contact narratives as if they're spiritual experiences or experiences of God, how we've misunderstood ancient encounters with technology and thought we were reading about something angelic or something spiritual. For me, it all comes down to what do the words mean? And so my linguistic foundation was really the bedrock of that.
Do you think it was intentional, those translations, to give that impression of?
There's a mix. Yeah, there's a mix. So I think some of it's unintentional. So we in the 21st century, if we go back to Hebrew texts, can read something visual that's being described and ask ourselves, what words do we have for that? And you'll realize, oh, these are technological words. Something technological is being described. 500 years ago, translators didn't have that. They didn't have that vocabulary. 500 years ago, people didn't know about rocket launches. They didn't know about vertical takeoff and landing. They didn't know about drones. They didn't know about helicopters. They didn't know about weapons of mass destruction. All of those are in the texts, but they didn't have the language for it, so they translated it in other ways. So there's an accidental mistranslation that happens, but then the intentional side of it is where the biblical stories went through a process of monotheization. So before the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the cultic practice and cultural memory of the tribes of Israel was to do with Paleo-Contact, or what scholars would call polytheism. Then King Hezekiah comes along, who wants to reform, or in effect create, Judaism as a theocracy, and then it evolves into a religion. So he wants to monotheize what's going on. So his God, Yahweh, is going to be the only God now, and all the other ones need forgetting. And so he sends his army into the temple to deface all the carvings, showing what the Elohim looked like, defacing all their names so no one will know about them. He gets rid of all the priesthoods, serving, putting on services commemorating beings like Milcom and Chemosh and Asherah. These were all part of Jewish cultic practice. Previously, these priesthoods had been set up by previous kings. These temples had been built by previous kings. They all had to be gotten rid of. So now there's only one God, Yahweh, his king, his high priesthood, his temple, all the tithes coming there. And so there was a process of a power grab for narrative control, for economic control, for hegemony, control over the environment, no other ministries of information. And that then leads into a narrative reform. And we see the emergence of the Book of Yahweh and the Book of the Laws of Yahweh, which gathered together the old stories and then rewrote them. And some of the rewriting is very easy to see. So in the book of Jeremiah, I'll give you for instance, Jeremiah says that on every high hill and under every green tree, from every garrison to every fortified city, there were installations commemorating Asherah. Now, he's just given us information about what the mainstream cultic practice was of the tribes of Israel. But then he puts a little gloss on it. He adds his opinion. Isn't that awful, he says. Isn't that idolatrous? Oh, okay. So that's wrong. All right, so that's wrong. Okay, so that's why we're getting rid of it. I understand. And you see that throughout the scriptures where Asher, for instance, changes from being this powerful figure who brought fertility to people and land, introduced people to agriculture, the foundations of civilization. Instead of being an advanced being, Asherah becomes an object that you hold in your hand. And in fact, we've now broken the heads off them, so you can't use them anymore. Asherah becomes a carved pole, which we can knock down. And we only talk about Asherah in terms of objects, not who the objects represent. So you see those kinds of changes. You see Yahweh being used now as a name for Almighty God, but you can still see in the early texts that Yahweh was one of many Elohim. Go to Deuteronomy 32, where you're looking at the Elohim Council, and you'll learn that he was a junior Elohim. He was not Almighty God. Get into the root meanings of the words concerned, and you'll realize Almighty God isn't Hebrew language. It is an invented translation for El Shaddai. And what El Shaddai really means, and I put my argument for this in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, what it really means is the powerful one, the destroyer. Wow. And again, read Deuteronomy 32. You've got a council of beings called Elohim. They're ruled over by a being called El Elyon. Yahweh is one of the Elohim, and we begin to get quite a finessed picture of multiple advanced beings who've shown up en masse. Their arrival is commemorated as the arrival of the Tzavah Hashemayim, the sky fleet. And then we've got stories of the division of land, where different Elohim get different portions of land. Yahweh gets a people group with no land, so he has to go to war to get land off the others. That frames all the stories of war among the Elohim, stories which make no sense until you do the translation work and realize we're looking at plural beings, not a single entity called God. But the redactors, as well as the translators, have rolled the stories of multiple beings into the story of a single being. So instead of having stories of war among many Elohim, you've now got a double-minded deity. When you go to the source narrative, for instance, of the flood, these are the Babylonian stories of the flood. You've got a story of one advanced being saying we need to cull the human beings, and another advanced being saying, I've got to rescue Project Humanity. In the Bible, that's been rolled into the story of a single deity. So it's the same deity saying, destroy them all, and then a deity saying, oh, I better rescue some. It's completely double-minded. In the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, it's now the one being who says, kill him. And then the same being who says, no, only joking. That's a monstrous story. But if you get into the original vocabulary, you can see that one being or one group of beings says, kill him. And another being says, don't do it, Abraham. And it begins to make a little bit more sense. So many stories of the Bible make more sense when you realize that they are the Hebrew retellings of Babylonian stories of Anunnaki, Dingir, Igigi, and that these stories from ancient Mesopotamia were not God stories. And for me, it was a light bulb moment to realize that so many of our God stories are based on Mesopotamian stories of sky people, Mesopotamian stories of colonization by advanced neighbors. And when you make that mistake of thinking these are God stories, you end up with a God who's a monster. And you have to justify the violence. You have to justify and applaud the misogyny and the xenophobia and all the killing that goes on, the brutality, the unforgiving character of this entity. So when I did this study and realized, oh my goodness, originally these weren't stories of God at all. These were stories of many beings doing what we all do when we invade each other's countries. It was a huge relief because I never thought God was like that.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. The double-minded God thing really got me because it's like everything got funneled into one thing, and it's telling the sort of mostly the same story, but through the it's like through one being, and that just doesn't, that never worked for me either, Paul. But how so what parallels across like Sumerian and Egyptian and other places across the world kind of lend to your theory of Paleo-Contact, or it's not necessarily your specific theory, but like what parallels across those like kind of make it undeniable at this point?
Well, the highest density of parallels you will find in the first 12 chapters of Genesis. And almost all those stories of beginnings that are in those chapters, you will find the earlier versions in the literature of ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. But there are correlations around the world as well. So if you go to Genesis 1, for instance, and you've got multiple beings turning up over a planet that's been devastated, that's in darkness, that's flooded, that's got an atmosphere thick with something, I would say dust and ash and soot, that gives you a black atmosphere where you can't see the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's the beginning of things in Genesis 1. It's the beginning of things in the Enuma Elish. It's the beginning of things in the Mayan story of origins. It's the beginning of things in the Filipino telling. It's the beginning of things in the Iroquois story.
Wow.
So these details repeat all around the world. And some of the details are fascinating. So to stay in Genesis 1, we've got a flooded planet with a dark sky. Well, that's how the Popol Vuh opens as well. That's the Mayan story. And then what is it that arrives in the sky? In the Bible, it's a ruach. And the fundamental meaning of that is wind or wind maker.
Wind or wind maker.
In the Mayan story, what is it that arrives in the sky? It's the feathered serpents.
Right.
And one of them is named Heart of the Sky. You go to the root meaning of its name. Huracan is where we get the word hurricane from.
Ooh.
So again, it's a strong wind hovering, or a wind maker hovering with beings inside it, feathered serpents. In the Bible, it's Elohim inside it, over this flooded world. and then it's vortices of wind that clear the water from the land to begin the reclamation work. Now, in the Bible, the Ruach arrives, and what does it do? Melahephet is the Hebrew word, and it means hover. It's the word you would use for a hawk. It hovers like a hawk over the waters to do this work. Go to a not widely known indigenous Filipino story, and the beginnings occur on a flooded planet. And what appears in the sky? Well, we call it a hawk, hovering over the flood waters, creating vortices of wind to drive the water back from the land to begin a process of rehabilitation. These correlations are global, and the idea that our creation stories turn out on a closer reading to be rehabilitation stories of a planet that already exists, it's been ruined, that really caught my attention. The Hebrew says that the planet is in a state of tohu wabohu, which means it's been devastated, it's been ruined by something. All this is there before Let There Be Light. And I believe that Let There Be Light is like a poetic recreation of an eyewitness account of rehabilitation. When the atmosphere gets cleared, now we can see the sun. Now we can see the moon. Now we can see the stars. Now there's night and day. Now the lands are being cleared. Now vegetation is recovering. Now animal life is recovering. And now we're being worked with by these powerful beings who also in the Bible are described as feathered serpents. And of course, theologians have taken these descriptions of Yahweh and the other Elohim as figurative and metaphorical. But why is it feathered serpents in the Hebrew story and the Mayan story and the Chinese story when we're talking about
I was going to say that.
planetary recovery? Why do we see the same emblems in Mesopotamian story? And it was these questions that led me on a journey around the world, asking different questions of our ancestral narratives. And now, instead of thinking these are either science, history, or they're pure fiction, now I ask, what memories do these stories carry? Because these stories have been carefully crafted to maintain a cultural memory of something. And when we read these accounts or listen to the oral traditions and treat them as a recollection of something visual, all these stories are going to give you the same visuals and raise the same questions.
That just blew my mind. But when talking about Eden specifically, the story of Eden, there's evidence of you talk about evidence of domestication and genetic engineering within that story, right? In your book. Can you elaborate on that? And is that an example of what you're talking about? Like old, messages and old stories encoded in what we've been taught?
Yes. So whether I'm looking at the biblical accounts in Genesis or the Mayan accounts in the Popol Vuh, or the stories of the Enuma Elish from ancient Mesopotamia, the Babylonian telling, or if I'm listening to the elders of the Efik people in Nigeria, they all have stories that when you picture them, it's clear what we're talking about is some kind of genetic engineering. They all talk about advanced non-human beings working with life on Earth in the past and tweaking what they have until they get us. And the Popol Vuh, the Mayan account, is very frank about it. And they say it took a long, long time for the feathered serpents to be able to engineer us. And their intention was to create a working class. Let us make human beings, the text says, so they can do the unpleasant work and bring us our food. In the Archdeacon, it is a matter of the Agigi saying, we don't like doing this civil engineering work. Can we create a being that can do this for us? And so they create humanity. So very similar story there. But they all have very particular imagery of combining biological material from Earth with their own DNA. And so they've got images for gene splicing. They've got images for hybridization until
Yeah, I
they
see
get
that all
us.
the
So
time.
they've all got this idea that what they end up with is a primate that looks a bit more like them than our hominid ancestors. And the correlations are really very compelling. But to get into the detail of that, let me recommend my book, Escaping from Eden.
Yeah.
And I take the reader through the process of spotting these parallels and realizing how close they really are. And remember, these are cultures that had nothing to do with each other. You know, the Efik people of Nigeria, the Maya of Guatemala, the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians, and then the Hebrews writing their stories. These are all separate cultures. And this does not bear the marks of a written story that's gone around the world and been rewritten, because it's different language, different characters, different dramatizations, different metaphor. But again, do the work of visualizing what you're being told, and you'll realize you're being fed the same information by separate cultures who are carrying the same ancient cultural memory.
Yeah, it kind of messes with my egotistical sense of importance, Paul.
Oh gosh, I know.
Yeah,
I know. It was difficult for me because, you know, for a long time as a Christian believer, I'd lived in this very safe universe, which was empty except for our lovely planet. And we, Homo sapiens, are the apple of God's eye. And so when I first started being confronted with ancestors telling me, actually, it's not that way. There were more advanced people who came here in the past, and they interfered with us in exactly the same way that we have interfered with horses, livestock, dogs. We've crossbred them and changed how they are so that they're better adapted to work for us or to be our pets. And now we're at the point of doing gene splicing. If God would allow humans to do that to the other life on planet Earth, why would it be any different for more advanced beings coming here and working with our ancestors? It was a kind of bereavement that happened for me when I realized the logic of that. I had theoretically accepted the probability that the universe is populated, but I hadn't thought through the implications of what that means. If we're a mid-ranking species, what does that mean? And this cozy relationship with a God who was really humanity writ large in my mind, was really a Santa Claus with greater powers. I realized that that couldn't be right. Really, as soon as you acknowledge the probability of a populated cosmos, your whole God concept is going to need to expand to accommodate that information.
Yeah. Either you said a mid-ranking species. I was, while you were talking, I was literally imagining you know, the beings that genetically engineered us. There's a higher level of beings that genetically engineered them to do stuff for them as well, and that potentially could go on forever.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the universe is big and it's very old, but the idea that life on Earth has origins in the galaxy, not on our planet, is not new.
No.
And in fact, really from the dawn of DNA science, that's been quite a mainstream view. So Francis Crick, one of the two co-discoverers of the double helix of DNA, held that view very early on. He said the planet is not old enough for DNA to have developed in this way and generated the forms of life which it has. Life and the genetic coding for coherent life forms has to be older. That's an old idea. That's an idea that's 60 years old. And it's a matter of thinking through the implications of that. So you can get to the idea of paleo-contact through various routes. You can do it through the DNA route. You can actually do it through neuroscience as well. It just so happens that my route has been through ancestral narratives and asking, what was it that our ancestors experienced and believed and layered into their stories that we may have misunderstood along the way.
Yeah, and so this relates to what we see. I haven't seen shit, but that's besides the point. But what people see today, UFOs, orbs, the like, and so how can we contextualize modern day UFO UAP phenomenon, disclosure, whatever, with what you've learned about Paleo-Contact?
Well, on the one hand, many ancestral stories are very unself-conscious in saying that our ancestors had contact with beings who are more advanced than us.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, every year I take groups to Turkey, to the Van and Bitlis provinces, and I show people firsthand, look at these carvings, look at the stories they're telling, read the cuneiform inscriptions, get into the stories they're telling. And if I can give a quick plug, you
Please.
can come with me in October and do this. I will be there. I've got space for up to 30 people, so I can take you to the sites where the carvings are, show you how they work, what the implications of them are. And that's just one culture telling these stories of contact in the past. And included in the symbols that we see are symbols that tell us that we're not the first people to see flying saucers. Flying saucers or flying shields or flying discs are there in the annals of many cultures around the world. So the Iron Age Urartian people had those stories. The Bronze Age people living in ancient Assyria had those stories. Stories carried in Zoroastrianism portray them in that way. There is at Erebuni, the Fortress of Blood in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, a painting that is 3,000 years old showing a blue sky full of flying shields. Flying shields are talked about in the Frankish annals of Charlemagne in the 8th century of the Common Era, describing flying shields attending their battles. There was a Roman author called Obsequens who gathered together stories of UAPs and put them in his book. So encounters with beings and craft are ages old. The book of Ezekiel has a very detailed explanation of an encounter with a craft and flying inside it. And the writer talks about the experience of flying, the sound of the engines, the feeling of the engines firing off, the movement of the rotors, the feeling of G-force as the thing moved. So the phenomena that we talk about today of things pinging into our airspace, of moving at speeds that we can't engage with and intercept, different shaped craft, saucer-shaped craft, tic-tac-shaped craft. These are ages old. They have been happening since antiquity. And I think that our ancestral stories often give us a different lens through which to view these phenomena. People today might look at this and might say, oh my goodness, is it the beginning of invasion of the body snatchers?
Right.
Is it the beginning of Mars attacks? Is this Independence Day? And our ancestors, though they had a whole kaleidoscope of experiences, they had a more positive take too. So the Urartian people in the Iron Age in ancient Armenia, they longed for the return of these advanced beings because they remember through ancestral story what technology sharing meant for them in the deep past. It was a huge leap forward. The Book of Enoch recalls a time of rich cultural exchange with advanced other beings, remembered as a huge cultural leap forward. And I think if we were more familiar with the ancestral stories, we might have an eye on, have we got friends at hand? Which I believe we do. Is it possible that we might get into technology sharing that can help humanity move forward?
I hope so.
And if we listen to serious witnesses like Jacques Vallée, the eminent information scientist, French information scientist, or the American astrophysicist Eric W. Davis, or the microbiologist from Stanford, Gary Nolan, or Hamish Shed, the brigadier general who for 28 years was Israel's chief of space security, they would all suggest actually we're already in that place. that there is contact happening at a covert level, and that we are being exposed to technology more advanced than our own. And yes, there is potential for humanity to make a great technological leap forward. And I think that's what we should be hoping for and pressing for. That's why I would like to see more of the light of accountability shone on the information possessed by US military intelligence, more light of accountability shone on the legacy program. Because if that technology, if we're on the threshold of that, that is something for humanity. Just at a practical level, if we have access to technology that gives us 0-point energy, and this is what's being talked about by these scientists. This is what Ed Mitchell was very strong on. For a whole decade ago, before he passed away, he was already talking about the government needs to open up because we need the 0-point energy that we have access to. Now, remember, as a NASA astronaut, he was bound by layers and layers of non-disclosure agreements. And yet he was saying that, he was indicating that he believed that we have access to 0-point energy. If that's the case, why do 8,000 old age pensioners freeze to death or die of hypothermia in Britain every year? That's the official statistics.
8,000?
8,000. That's the official statistics from the UK Bureau of Statistics. Because they can't afford power, because they can't afford electricity, because they can't afford fuel. If our governments are allowing that to happen, when at a covert level we've got access to 0-point power, we need to ask questions about who has this information, in whose interests are decisions being made here. It would transform our world. I mean, in Australia, our politicians, whether you're looking at left wing, right wing, they are all under the power of the electricity industry. They're not even allowed to legislate anything that impinges on the electricity industry, apparently. All that would change. Our whole political life here would change if we had access to 0-point power. In the United States of America, I'm sorry to say that the oil barons dictate a lot of what happens in American politics in a way that is to the disadvantage of the 99%. All that would disappear if all of a sudden we had access to 0-point power. And the oil industry is powerful, and it overlaps with the pharmaceutical industry as well, of course. There's a lot of power bases which would have the rug pulled out from under their feet if all of a sudden we all knew that we have military intelligence that's curating 0-point power technology. For me, that's a really urgent aspect to a path towards disclosure. To me, that's the real scandal of this information being kept under wraps. But as I say, our ancestors knew that technology sharing had happened in the past and it had helped us. And I think we should look to the future with a hope like that. If there are beings that we're in contact with, then clearly it's because they've got technology way superior to ours. Hair Mashed says we're already in conversation. I'd like to know a little bit more about what's happening.
Yeah, that's deep, man. And the 99% to the 1%, that's the part that really bothers me, because you're talking about a few hundred families, you know, whatever they say it is, 400 families, 5,000 people, whatever, that, you know, are in control of all this stuff. And then maybe even just a small percentage of them actually are privy to what the real source of, like, you know, this technology that we're being exposed to. And that really chaps my ass, for lack of a better word, Paul. But I like your hopeful, like, outlook. And I wonder, I mean, we have to be hopeful about this stuff. But I wonder, like, we talk about movies like Independence Day and stuff like that. There's only a handful of, like, ET type stories, right? Everything else is like alien invasion, right? And that's part of the psyop, is it not? like us to be scared of these entities and for us to be scared of this technology? Or is that just like them making movies that we like watching, and it's really
I think
our own accountability here?
some of it, I think, is just what is cinematic.
Yes.
What's fun to watch. Space battles are fun to watch.
Yeah, they are.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers is fun to watch.
Independence, one of my favorite movies. I went to see it with my dad when I was like 13. I'll never forget it. But seeing that movie for the first time.
So I think some of it is, look, that's just storytelling. At the same time, I take my hat off to those who are writing for the Marvel universe these days, because there's a lot of ancestral story, ancient story layered into that.
Really?
You'll find Mesopotamian story in that. You'll find Plato in that.
Like Thor in there.
Yeah, absolutely. These writers, that's right. So Norse mythology as well, Greek mythology. The writers know what they're doing, and they are familiarizing us with what is actually a more positive layer to the story of human mythology, ancient contact, Paleo-Contact. But I think the fear factor has been useful to what Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex.
Exactly.
And we can be really specific about what he meant by that. He meant the aerospace industry. He meant corporations like Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Skunk Works. These are the corporations whose undercover units, their black units, are working on the legacy program, and they get their enormous black budgets really on the fear factor. If we are defending our planetary security or our
weapons of mass destruction,
security, then of course you'll get the budgets for those things. And I think that the fear element has been played up at that level because that can be leveraged, that can get us the budgets. So I think that skews the conversation as well. And even the conversation that's happening now, where there are legislators, people like Tim Burchett, who are really campaigning for more openness and disclosure, it is on that fear factor. It is on the basis of, we deserve to know what the threat is, sort of storyline.
Exactly.
And we need a bigger lens than just
gun.
that.
No, he need a bigger gun. Yeah, it messes me up a little, like, to think that like I was getting my paycheck from that for like 8 years, and like I went looking for weapons of mass destruction for the military-industrial complex, because they do that. They recruit young men and women to go, and it usually from disadvantaged environments and stuff like that. And it's like, this is my way to go to college, right? This is my way out of not going to prison, right? That's most of the people that join the military, And so it's like being a small piece of that is weird.
It offers a lot. It offers education. It offers community. It offers camaraderie, order, power, of course, because you've got weapons.
Oh yeah, you feel like the man.
You feel like the man. That's right, absolutely. But it's interesting to me that probably the biggest demographic among those who read my books or watch my channels are veterans of U.S. defense. And especially those who've been deployed in the theaters of war. First of all, because that whole experience, probably more than anything, serves to dislodge people from the mainstream. You're having a non-mainstream experience, and one that is likely to traumatize you at some level. So there's that right off the bat. But also, you will come back with profound geopolitical questions. What in the world were we doing there? Because I can't make sense of it. And the public reasons are not the real reasons. And so I have friends who were deployed in the 2003 incursion into Iraq, coming back Now, the public story is we were there for regime change. We were there to free the Kurds. We were there to free the world from the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And so people came back thinking, well, I don't think those were the reasons. And what were the reasons? And why am I hearing stories, or why was I in a unit that wasn't doing any of those things? Why were we bagging up archaeological artifacts and flying them out of the country? Why were there all these stories about looking for technology so that we could sequester that? Why, within, what was it, 10 days of going in, have we got an archaeological team trying to dig up the tomb of Gilgamesh? Why is that so urgent as we go into Iraq? Was that actually a reason further forward in the mix? People come back full of questions. And of course, where'd you go with them? Who can you ask? I mean, you can't ask the higher ups. And so this has driven a lot of people to me. People go to the internet. That's right. And so people have come to The Fifth Kind on YouTube. They've come to Escaping from Eden and the books that have followed. People are now with me in an online learning community at Ancient Knowledge Academy, because they have to get an answer to these questions, because they have changed their world. This isn't just a curious mind pursuing some speculation. The world is not what I thought it was. I have to understand why we experienced what we did, why we were there. I have to get my head around what happened. And it's that that's brought people to me over the last now 7-8 years in particular to get into dialogue with me, because people see me on The Fifth Kind and they think maybe I can share my questions or my experience with him. Or they'll read one of the Eden books and they'll think, yes, this is getting to something I've been wondering about. And as I say, that's the biggest demographic, I think, among all my readers.
Wow, you just blew my mind there. There's so much I could say about that, but I'll tell you a quick story about what I was doing in Iraq. Not me personally, but like, actually me personally, but like my unit and stuff. And the reason my base existed at all was there was this town called Ashraf. And in Ashraf, there was a group of what were labeled as international terrorists called the People's Mujahideen of Iran. And they were against the Iranian regime. So they lived in Iraq, and there was a large group of them. They had a whole in the 80s. They had a whole system. They had doctors and they had tanks, and they had like a whole. They were a functioning society with a military and everything. And Saddam used to. But he was basically tolerated them in the country of Iraq because they would do things for them, like gas a bunch of Kurds one time, or they would also kind of be a buffer between him and Iran, right? But when the United Nations rolled in, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, or the PMOI, they just surrendered everything. And so immediately they did this on purpose, because immediately their entire city was classified as a refugee, essentially, right? And so what they had to do was stick a military post next to this base to guard these people while they decide, they tried to find places for them to go, because they're technically refugees, right? Now, some of it stayed. Some people just fled the city and ended up somewhere in Iraq. A lot of people, several thousand, stayed in the city. And then some people would try to defect, and then they'd end up in a detainee facility that I also spent a lot of time at as well. And I think the story goes, when we left, and they started taking down operations in Iraq, whenever that was, early 2010s. Basically, those people were just left to fend for themselves. But our job was literally just to guard these people. I had to drive in and out of not me and my group. We would drive in and out of Baghdad and take them shopping and stuff like that, and then take them back. And as a medic, I would have to go to the detainee facility and basically do sick calls, what we call basically doctor's call, for these detainees. And I became friends with a lot of them and stuff like that. And it was the weirdest experience of my life. Strangely, I was 23. And part of my job was to go down to the PMOI's headquarters in their city with my my medical CO, and it was just me and him. We'd drive into the city in a Humvee, just me and him. We'd go to their like main eating hall and stuff like that, and they'd have all these military guys, old guys in suits with in military uniform with like you know, rank, insignia, all that stuff. And we'd have to do this whole thing where they'd talk about world events with us. I was like 23. I had no fucking idea what was happening. I'm going to be honest. But they would talk about world events with us for a little bit. Then we'd talk business, where my job was to basically take down the medical supplies that they needed. And then I had to, when I got back, put it into the system and then go pick it up at another base and bring it back. But during that meeting, we would literally be talking about like what's going on in London, what's going on in the United States, what's going on in the war and stuff like that. And we'd have like a 4-course meal. They'd be serving us tea the whole time. Then we'd have like a bunch of different food. I think it's the first time I told this story on the podcast, but you just compelled me to do so, because when the thing is like I drank a lot of the Kool-Aid in order to like survive basic training and my medic school and then go to Iraq. But I didn't have PTSD from like the things I did and saw, although I did things and saw things. I had PTSD from like having my fucking worldview shattered by like going over there and being like, what the? So then I spent like years on the internet going like, who are the fucking Anunnaki and what's going on here and shit.
So those conversations you were having, they were like conversations from another world.
Oh yeah,
and, you couldn't go back to the same world after those conversations.
No, not at all, man, not at all. And so so you've got a full-on website, thefifthkind.com, the Fifth Kind TV.
Fifthkind.tv. And then my personal website is paulanthonywallis.com. And I'll give you my other links as well. So there's ancientknowledgeacademy.com. That's where we deep dive into these subjects. If you want to come with me to Turkey or to Thailand Praveen Mohan, excellent.
No. He's one of my favorites. We love Praveen. Sorry.
Well, we're partnering in November to take people around temples in Thailand and show people the carvings and then talk about how we interpret them, how they relate to ancestral story of contact. So that's November. And then October, going to Van and Bitlis provinces in Turkey. So go to ancientknowledgetours.com and register for that. And go to my website, paulanthonywallis.com, if you want to come to Thailand with me and Praveen Mohan.
Well, Praveen is doing just absolutely outstanding work that no one else is really doing. A lot of people are partnering up with him now, but I've discovered him on YouTube like several years ago and just devoured everything he was watching, because he was showing me things that nobody ever showed me before in the context that he showed me. So I would absolutely love to go to. I'm more interested in the Turkey trip, but because I'm such a fanboy of Praveen Mohan, I'm leaning in that direction.
They're different. Well, Turkey's 10 days. It's just a week in Thailand, which makes it a bit more affordable as well. Maybe I can tempt you to come with us to Thailand and we'll have some fun there.
If Praveen's watching, I'm sorry, but for some reason, I'm a very sociable guy and I can talk to anyone, but for some reason, every time I'm around Praveen Mohan, I turn into a blithering idiot. And so I'm hoping that if I spend a week on a tour with him, then I can like shake that off a little bit, because I'm just a huge fan of the guy.
What you need is some exposure therapy, Dave. So
there you go.
Come on that tour.
Approachable. He's super easy to talk to.
There you go. Paul, I wanted to hopefully leave on a positive, sort of hopeful for the future note. So with all the information that's now coming out that people have access to, and people like you and people like Praveen Mohan and a bunch of other people like spreading the truth that's been hidden to us for all the reasons we talked about today. What do you see as like our way through this current, because you can see it, right? It's shaken from side to side, left to right, literally.
Yeah.
We need to break through that. And what do you see on the other side?
0 point energy.
There you go.
I think we've always lived in a soup of company. I think if you ask your friends when they're in a trusting kind of frame of mind, if they've ever had the sense that they're getting assistance living their life, because in coaching, I've often I've made this observation when I've been in the coaching space. I'm coming to believe every one of us has an invisible team of helpers around us who are there to help nudge us through life. And I've yet to have a coaching client who didn't say, I'm coming to suspect that as well. Not because they've been taught it, because they read it in a book or they were taught that at Sunday school, but because they're experiencing it. I think the human race has always had support. We've always had friends in high places. And though there's plenty to be worried about in our geopolitics right now, and though Ancestral Story has some worrying stories in it of exploitation by unscrutable 1% of 1%, there's a lot of reason to believe that we have company that wants humanity to have a more positive experience moving forward. So I encourage people to follow their curiosity, to follow their intuition, to be a little bit more confident that we individually and we as a species are being supported. And I think if we can approach life that way, then we can be a little bit more confident. And I also go back to Plato, considering what he thinks is the meaning of life. Plato thinks that you and I are here to have experiences and to have the best human experience that we can. And that the best way to have the best human experience is to learn how to shake off heavier emotions like fear, anxiety, rage, trauma, despair, ambition, competition. If you can learn how to shake those off and operate at a higher level that is more motivated, excited, curious, compassionate, loving, inquisitive, you're going to have a better experience. And I found that really helpful because when I was stuck in my very narrow Orthodox Christian worldview, I thought my life was about tiptoeing around, trying not to offend the Almighty, making sure I'm doing what he wants me to do, like I'm walking some tightrope. Now I believe I'm here to learn as much as I can, to have as good an experience as I can. I want to find out what's what, and I would love to find ways to nudge us all to a more positive experience. And I find that excites more confidence in me. And I would just encourage others in that kind of direction.
It gives me a sense of comfort to, try to shift my daily belief into being supported by something, because sometimes I feel like a lone cowboy out here.
I think also, I think there is something in what Plato is saying about what you attract, because if you can be proactive before you step out your front door, if you've made a decision that your intention is to have a good day and that everyone you interact with, you want them to feel better after interacting with you. If you go at life with that energy, you will attract better conversations and you'll attract people with a similar energy. And if you make that your general approach to life, you will find it really puts fuel into your tank. It really supports you, gives you energy. And we need that from each other. It's not a solitary journey. Whether we're connecting locally or online like this, we need these kind of connections to keep us pepped up and moving in the right direction.
Yeah, man, that's what I do every time I leave the house. Well, it's sometimes if you got the whatever the icks or something, but I try my best to, if I see people, I don't care what they look like, I don't care how old they are, how young they are, I say hi to everyone, and I try to do it with a kind look and a friendly face. And sometimes it turns into a conversation with somebody that like I never would have imagined having a conversation with, and it's such a valuable experience. And I find myself doing that more now that the Iran stuff started happening, and I completely turned off. I don't pay attention to it at all. Every time somebody tries to talk to me about it, I'm like, I'm not paying attention to that. And then I've been trying to do what you just said, like recently. So that's very affirming for me. And that's a really positive message to leave to end the show on. Megan, do you have any final comments for Paul before we wrap up?
Just that I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Yeah, same.
Really speaks to me and the type of work that I'm trying to do. And your ending comments there are very encouraging for me to keep up my curiosities and looking for answers.
Well, Megan, that is music to my ears, and I'll just mention the order of the books if anyone needs to know that. It's Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, The Invasion of Eden, and my latest, The Eden Enigma. And if you read them in that order, you're kind of following my own journey of deconstruction and reframing, and I think it's fun that way.
Fabulous.
I've never done this after a show, but I'm literally ordering that book, the first book right now. And I'm also going to start trying to work my wife into going to Thailand mode in November, right?
November, that's right.
Yeah.
If you're over in Thailand, we can go over to see Gunung Padang in Indonesia. It's right next door.
Well, that's definitely on my list. There's so many places on my list, Paul. You've been all over the place. I'd love to go to some of these places with you. So, and my wife and I are due for a trip, man. So,
great.
Thank you so much, Paul, for joining the Multiverse. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I feel like we could talk about a bunch of other different things that we haven't yet. So hopefully maybe you'll come talk to me about some other stuff at another time.
Sure.
But for now, Paul, I'm just happy to thank you, Oleg, if he's watching. He's going to be watching because he's my editor. But thank you, Oleg, for making this connection. And Paul, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining the Multiverse, my friend.
Great pleasure. Thank you both for having me today.
Subscribe to Dave's Multiverse on YouTube, Spotify, and Rumble today.